Today we're going to reflect on matters of life and death, the art of living and the art of dying. We're going to look today at existential questions. Who are we? Who are we called to be? And where are we going? And more importantly, how to live a happy life. And living a happy life, a holy life, and a holy life, a moral life. In ages past, people would strive to have a good death. They would work toward that. The idea was, may you have a happy death. It became known as the art of dying, or ars moriendi, and later developed into the idea of ars vivendi, or the art of living. Epicurus said, the art of living well and the art of dying well are one. So this idea that if we could live a good life, it would help us to have a happy death. If one can live well, one can die well. If we can live a good life, then we have the tools to prepare for a good death, which is union with God, our ultimate aim. So what we're going to do is do some reflections around preparing for death by living a good life and asking the question, what constitutes a happy life? We begin by asking the question, what is human flourishing? What does it mean to be a human being? What do our scriptures and our traditions tell us and teach us? What is this idea of human flourishing? Living closer to our intended design, as we were meant to be. Happiness is prevalent in the media these days. Scientific researchers are mapping the brains of people who meditate, and there's an app designed to help folks become 10% happier. The pursuit of happiness has become big business. It was the goal for the Greeks, and Cesaro says that the church insists that happiness remains the goal of all human activity. So what is happiness? Who and what are we created to be? Who are we meant to be? What is our design? What is our design? Have we lived up to that design? Have we lived lives as they were meant to be? What might I do differently? How might I have lived differently? What new choices might I make today and for the future so that I do not have to fear death or the end of life? So the question before us is, what is a happy life? Jesus was asked in Matthew 19:16, what must I do to gain eternal life? Living a happy life allows us to come to a happy death. And God desires for us to be happy. Pinker says, God supplies us with what we need to know about a happy life. The Beatitudes speak of being happy, blessed. Many of the scriptures say, happy are the poor in spirit, or blessed are the poor in spirit. So the Beatitudes are a benchmark for the Christian. A happy life is a life of virtue and a moral life. So how do we do that? One of the ways that we experience happiness is to experience beauty, truth, and goodness. So what is holiness then? It's not happiness being in line with our design, as our teacher says. Part of that design is encountering beauty in all its forms, which points us to the ordered design of God, which is truth. Experiences of beauty and truth invite us to a goodness. living a life of holiness and a moral life, because we're invited into order. I love this picture because it reminds me of the order in the universe, the design in the universe. And one of the things that happens when we expose ourselves to beauty and to the beauty of the universe is it helps to restore within us our own order. So we might feel disordered. Ignatius speaks about disordered passions and disordered orientations. And oftentimes we need to reorder ourselves. And we do that through beauty. A piece of music, a great piece of art, a piece of poetry, a great book. It restores order within ourselves. Many of us are familiar with the idea of an examination of conscience. But I was reading a book recently, and the idea was the idea of rereading at the end of a day, to reread your day, to review and to replay the day. So what if we began to do that with our lives and not wait till the very end of our lives to do that? In pastoral care, we talk about a life review. What if we did that sooner than later? And not just the day, but our lives. What will God ask of us at the end? And what will we need to be prepared for? So instead of looking at just the day, how can we look at our lives in order to prepare? Who are we? We are made in the image and likeness of God, created in God's image. Genesis says that God saw and said that it was good, very good. We are good, made good. All is good, and all is called to goodness. Creation is orderly and beautiful and good. We are created intentionally and created in God's image. What does that mean? What does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? What does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? What happens when we forget or lose sight of the fact that we are made in the image and likeness of God? Cicero says, Christian moral theology must attend to whatever is required to restore fully the imago Dei in each human being. This working out of salvation entails the progressive restoration of the godly image, restoring good as meant, God's intentions, to restore that image of God. Being made in the image and likeness of God, our response is a response to God's love. And that response is to live a moral life, a life of goodness and holiness, and an invitation to imitate God. Gregory of Nyssa says, the goal of a virtuous life is to become like God. And living a life of virtue brings us into conformity with our ultimate end, which is union with God, union with that image of God, so that we begin to imitate the goodness and holiness of God. So at the end of each section, we're going to take some time for reflection. So the questions for us are also in your handout, and you can take these home and use these later for reflection, but we'll use some of them today. So the question is, who are we? And what does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? We might too ask ourselves, what happens when we forget or lose sight of the fact that we are made in the image and likeness of God? How has life deformed or disfigured that image of God in us? Or maybe how we have not lived up to that image of God. And we need to ask those questions sooner than later. Another element that we look at is the fact that we are rational creatures. We are given reason to choose, and reason regulates our freedom. Reason and freedom give us the ability to choose good and right actions, the power to engage in excellent actions. We are free to choose freedom from and freedom for. We are self-aware. We are free to be and to do what we are created to do and to be, and what we're designed to do and to be. Augustine says, "A happy life is joy born of the truth." Pinker says, "The natural inclination toward truth and goodness is the work of God, and our bond with God does not limit our human freedom." That's good news. The Catechism says, "The natural desire for happiness is from God and divinely placed in the human heart." That's 1718 from the Catechism. Pinkhairs has a great line where he says, "From our birth we have received moral freedom as a talent to be developed, as a seed containing the knowledge and truth and the inclination toward goodness and happiness. And the goal of the human person is to nurture and develop that seed and pursue goodness and holiness as imago Dei, so that we grow into the holiness of God. We grow into that image of God, which is that human flourishing." Questions for reflection in this section are, am I living out my intended design and purpose? What are the excellent actions I am or need to be invited and engaged in? Have I settled for less than excellent actions? Think about the rich young man who walked away sad. Have I lived in freedom or fear or obligation? And have I used my mind to grow and change? As a church, we talk about the incarnation. But one of the things that's really important to remember is that we too are incarnational. We are a body and a soul. We're not just a body, but a body and a soul. And what is a body born to do? How can we live in such a way that we live incarnationally? So the questions for this section are, how have I treated this wonderful gift of life? This body, this world, this planet? Have I been a good steward of the gifts of creation? How have I delighted in creation and in beauty, in the gifts of the senses? How have I cared for this gift and these gifts? How have I cared for the bodies of others? Have I used, abused, or treated them as a gift? And how have I paid attention to the beauty of God's creation and of human creation? It's all about relationships. We are made and wired to be connected, to be relational. We are social beings. We're made to communicate and we're made to connect. Pope Francis, in his TED Talk, talks about that the future is made of encounters and interactions. No one is an island. The other word he uses quite often is encuentro, the idea of encounter, that every one of our interactions is an encounter and an opportunity. So this idea of being relational is also an invitation to grow in freedom in terms of how we respond to one another. That we encounter not only ourselves, but we encounter God in each encounter. As we look at the idea of encuentro, or encounter, or relationships, the questions for us are, do I believe that we are all connected? Have I lived in such a way that acknowledges that I need other people? Or do I tend to be pretty independent? How have I connected with others? How have I been disconnected, and how? And how might I change? What do I want to change in terms of connection and disconnection? And what can I do to make those changes in the future? The next part of that question is, how do I relate to God? And do I really believe that I'm connected to God and Christ's presence? Or do I live kind of independently of that and only look toward God when there's a struggle? But do I rejoice in the graces that God has given me each day? And that sense of the interconnectedness between my life and the life of the church, the life of grace, all those interconnections that occur. This next section uses a word that is often used in legal terms, but it's an interesting one. It's that everything is contingent on God's creation, that we are God's creation. We are contingent on God's grace and love, and everything is a gift from God. So this idea that we're not independent, it goes with the relational piece, but that everything is a gift. It's contingent on God's grace. It's contingent on God's love. So the questions for this section are, how do how do I remember that everything depends on God? And how do I acknowledge that? How have I ignored or squandered the gifts I've been given? Do I wake up each day realizing that every breath is contingent on the grace of God? I know when we get sick and then we get well again, we're incredibly grateful and thankful. But when we're well, we don't always remember that everything depends on that gift. So take some time to think about how often you have remembered that everything depends on God. And how do you incorporate that into your day? This next section is reminds us that we have a supernatural nature and orientation. It's not just physical. We long for the eternal, something more. We desire God, not just this material world. We are not just temporal beings, because our ultimate goal is not here. It's not physical. Our ultimate goal is God. We are always somewhat dissatisfied with this life. We are always desiring something more. The key to renewal is to discover our spiritual nature in its spontaneous yearning for truth, goodness, and happiness. Pinker says that on page 76. This idea that our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee, O God. William of St. Thierry says that humans have a natural bent by which the spirit tends toward higher things. We are not oriented toward this world, but we are oriented toward something more. In French, they say the le plus, the more. So we invite, in these next reflections, to look at how are we oriented in that direction. The questions for this section are, do I pay attention to the spiritual nature of the world, the supernatural? How do I tend to my soul? Have I tended to my soul? Where has my focus been? Where has my attention and my focus been? On things of the world or on God? And how do I care for my spiritual nature, my supernatural orientation? What matters to me most? And Jesus would ask, where is my treasure? I love this picture, and I love this idea of living liturgically. We are made for worship. It's what we do. One of the music ministers at our parish at a meeting the other day said, "The reason to go to church is to give thanks." And the question for us is, how is our life a life of thanks? Pinker says this. He says, "The Christian life is true worship. It is a liturgy where we offer to God as a living sacrifice our bodies and..." He says we offer our bodies and our persons as a living sacrifice, discerning what is good and pleasing to God. That we return the gifts that have been given. Return back to God the gifts that have been given. I think this next session, the questions are hard. Because the questions are things like, what have I worshipped in this life? What has held my gaze? One of the end-of-life tasks is to say thank you and to make amends, to say I'm sorry, to say please forgive me. So the question, one of those, is thanks. Have I lived a life of gratitude, a grateful life? How have I said what I need to say to my loved ones? Have I said those things? What needs my thanks and my gratitude? Who needs my forgiveness? And who do I need to forgive? In the beginning of this reflection, we talked about the Beatitudes. Francis calls it the Beatitudes the identity card of the Christian. The Catechism says that it confronts us with our moral choices and is an invitation to purify our hearts. Francis also says it sets standards, challenges us, unsettles us, and makes demands of us. Pinker says that the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount leads us into a new order of things, to live in the spiritual freedom in the context of our friendship with the Lord and our brothers and sisters. It's a new law based on love and freedom, not obligation and prescription, based in the relationship with Christ. Francis, in his document, says that it speaks clearly and passionately to contemporary modern culture in his analysis and reflections around the Sermon on the Mount. To be happy and blessed is to be holy. And Jesus lays out a clear path for the faithful Christian and action in his Sermon on the Mount. The values run countercultural to the values of the world and the prescriptions of the world. So then the question is, how do we have a happy life that leads to a good and happy death? That is our question. Do good and avoid evil. To learn from suffering, that suffering can help us to come to joy. Another question we need to ask ourselves is, have I lived from obligation or have I lived in freedom? Have I tried to dominate my nature or followed my nature, particularly my supernatural nature? Another question we might ask is, what habits can I develop to bring me closer to my intended design? Another question might be, if I were to create a rule for my life based on the Beatitudes or the virtues, what would it include? Francis created a life for his monks. Francis de Sales created a rule for life for lay women and lay men. What kind of life rule would I create? What changes do I need to make to my own life? Where am I feeling called to change and grow? And what do I need to do to prepare for a happy death? The real question is, how do I want to spend the time I have left? So then the question is, how do we have a happy life that leads to a good and happy death? That is our question. Do good and avoid evil. to learn from suffering, that suffering can help us to come to joy. Another question we need to ask ourselves is, have I lived from obligation or have I lived in freedom? Have I tried to dominate my nature or followed my nature, particularly my supernatural nature? Another question we might living a good life, living a happy life, living a blessed life is a life of worship. It's a life of intimacy with God, with other people, with beauty, with nature. It's an incredible gift. Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee, O God. And we were made to be in union with God. Much of our sadness and our anxiety and our struggles is because we forget this. So, living a good life and preparing for a happy death is to be reminded always. It is to be reminded always that life is a gift, that everything we have is contingent upon God's mercy and God's grace, and that we are made for union with God. And our life is meant to grow in that direction. So as we seek to live a good life, we will not be afraid of death. As we prepare to close this retreat, this reflection, these sessions around a happy life and a good death, I want to thank you for your listening and for your participation, and I will continue to pray for you as you live a good life and prepare for a happy death. Your handouts include a list of all the sources and resources that I've used, and also in your handouts there are the quotes that I've used are cited in those sections, so you can go back and read those quotes. And also the questions are available for your continued reflection. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.